Yes, students, good morning and a very warm welcome to today's class. So, we'll be starting a new chapter from our book Footprints Without Feet. That is chapter number 1, A Triumph of Surgery. Again, it's a very interesting chapter and जैसे जैसे आप इसे पढ़ते जाओगे your interest will be more and more. ठीक है? क्योंकि इसकी स्टोरी ऐसी है कि as and as the we can say the parts come up तो उसके साथ ही आपका इंटरेस्ट भी जो है it also again come up. Okay, so see a triumph of surgery. Basically, ये triumph of surgery जो है ना, it's a story of a small dog named Tricky. It's Tricky is a very pampered dog and overfed by her mistress. उसकी mistress उसे इतना प्यार करती थी and she's a rich mistress that she over pampers the dog and overfeeds the dog. And this is written by James Alfred Witt and इन्होंने इसको लिखा था under the pen name James Harriet. Okay, so James Harriet is basically the pen name. This James Harriet, he is a veterinary surgeon and he used his personal experience just to pen down a series of stories about animals and their owners. And from that series, one story we have of a small dog, Tricky. And Tricky is a pampered and overfed dog by his rich mistress. Because of this overfeeding, this Tricky falls seriously ill and his mistress consults a veterinary surgeon. Now, what to do? कैसे करें ट्रिकी को रिकवर कैसे करें ट्रिकी को ठीक दिस वाज अ बिग प्रॉब्लम so see does he performs an operation now the name of the chapter is surgery and surgery itself tells us that it's an operation so does he performs an operation does the dog recover these two are a very big questions that we are going to solve in this chapter okay so see so just read and find out that why is Mrs. Pumphrey worried about Tricky. What does she do to help him? Is she wise in this? And who does I refers to in this story? So see, I was really worried about Tricky this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in a secret street with his mistress and I was shocked at his appearance. He had become hugely fat. Okay, like a blotted sausage and a leg at each corner, his eyes bloodshot and rheumy stared straight ahead and his tongue lolled from his jaws. Now he says that he really, this time, Mr. Harriet is I, and he's saying that this time, while looking at Tricky, I was really worried. I pulled up my car when I saw in the street his mistress and Tricky both, and I was shocked at Tricky's appearance. Why? Because Tricky जो था ना इतना ज़्यादा मोटा ठीक है like it's compared to a blotted sausage with leg at each corner. His eyes were bloodshot just red and he stared straight ahead and his tongue उसकी जो tongue थी ना it was lolled from his jaws means it was hanging from his jaws okay yes so Mrs. Pumphrey hastened to explain he was so listless Mr. Harriet he seemed to have no energy I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. So I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up. Some malt and cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. Now Mrs. Pumphrey, she just hastened to explain. वो ये बताना चाह रही थी that Tricky is very listless, Mr. Harriet. ऐसा लग रहा है Tricky में कोई energy नहीं है and I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. So I have always been giving him some extras between the meals just इसलिए so that she उसे थोड़ा बिल्डअप मिल सके उसका थोड़ा हम बोलते हैं ना थोड़ा एनर्जी रीगेन हो सके लाइक आई गिव हिम सम माल्ट cold liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep nothing much really and did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you now Mr. Harriet says कि मैंने आपको बताया था that cut these sweet things so have you cut down on the sweet things oh I did for a bit but he seemed to be so weak I had to relent. He does love cream cakes and chocolate, so I just can't bear to refuse him. I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. Now she says that, oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak, I had to relent. and he does love cream cakes and chocolates, so I just can't bear to refuse him. And मैंने अपने डॉग की तरफ देखा, at that little dog, that was the trouble, यही तो परेशानी थी. ट्रिकी का ओनली फॉल्ट क्या था? was the greed. ठीक है, एंड ही हैज नेवर बीन नोन टू रिफ्यूज फूड, और उसने तो कभी खाने को ना करना सीखा ही नहीं. डॉग्स की ना ये एक ही स्पेशल फीचर होता है, दैट डॉग डज नॉट नो हाउ टू रिफ्यूज फूड, एंड दिस वाज द सेम थिंग विद ट्रिकी. And he would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night, and I wondered about all the things जो मिसेस पंफ्री ने अभी मेंशन नहीं की थी, and I really wondered पता नहीं वो इसे क्या क्या खिलाती होंगी. Now, next question put by Dr. Harriet was, are you giving him plenty of exercise? क्या आप उसे plenty of exercises दे रही हैं? Well, he has his little walks with me, as you can see. But Hodkin, the gardener, had been down with lumbago, so there has been no ring throwing lately. Now she says, well, उसको कुछ लिटिल वॉक्स ही हैज विद मी, एंड एज यू कैन सी, बट हॉटकिंस जो हमारा गार्डनर था ना, हैज बीन डाउन विद लिम्बैगो, एंड सो देयर हैड बीन नो रिंग थ्रोइंग लेटली. तो अभी रिंग थ्रोइंग का जो गेम था वो अभी नहीं हुआ. ठीक है, बिकॉज लिम्बैगो, व्हाट काइंड ऑफ डिजीज इज लिम्बैगो? लिम्बैगो क्या डिजीज होती है मालूम है? बैक एक, बैक प्रॉब्लम हो जाती है ना किसी किसी को, वो वाली डिजीज होती है. सो उनका गार्डनर नहीं आ रहा, सो ट्रिकी के साथ खेले कौन? Now see, I tried to sound severe. Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he's going to be really ill, and you must harden your heart and keep him on a strict diet. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I'm sure you are right. But it is so difficult, so very difficult. She sets off, head down, along the road, as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. I watched their progress, and with growing concern, Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I had heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Tricky would eat nothing, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on a rug panting, didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. I had my plan in advance, and the only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. Now he says, this time I tried to sound little severe, and I just told, now I really mean this, ma'am. You should cut his food right down now and give him more exercise, otherwise he's really going to be ill. And you must harden your heart and keep Tricky on a very strict diet. So Mrs. Pumphrey just wrung her hand, and she says, Mr. Harriet, मैं try करूँगी, I'll really try, but I am sure आप बिल्कुल सही कह रहे हो, but it's very difficult, it's so very difficult. And by saying this, she just sets off, heads down along the road, and as if ऐसा लग रहा था जैसे she is determined कि वो इस new चीज जो उनको बताई गई है, she is definitely going to put it into practice immediately. And Mr. Harriet kept on standing, and he looked at the progress with growing concern. Tricky was just tottering along in a little tweed coat, and उसके पास में पूरा wardrobe था coats का. Coats for the cold weather, coats for raincoat for the wet days, and so on many more. He struggled on drooping in his harness. अपनी harness पे बेचारा से droop करता हुआ, bend करता हुआ, he was just struggling to walk. And I thought it would be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. And I really thought कि बस ज़्यादा समय नहीं होगा, and Mrs. Pumphrey is definitely going to call me. And the expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Tricky would eat nothing. Tricky ने कुछ नहीं खाया. Refused even his favorite dishes. उसने अपनी favorite dishes भी refuse कर दी. And besides, और इसके अलावा, he had bouts of vomiting. Vomitings भी हो रही थी, and he spent all his day, उसने अपना पूरा दिन कैसे बिताया? Lying on the rug panting, and didn't want to go for walk. He did not want to do anything, means he was very unwell, and he was not at all fit to do anything. So Mr. Harriet, as expected था उनको कि ये होगा, so he had made his plans in advance, and the only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. And he suggested Mrs. Pumphrey that your Tricky needs to be hospitalized for about a fortnight, that is for 15 days, to be kept under observation, और उसे हम अपनी observation में रखेंगे. The poor lady almost swooned, and she was sure he would pine and die if she did not see her every day. And poor lady almost, जैसे बोलते हैं ना, unconscious, she was literally fainting ये सुनते ही, and she was sure कि he would pine, कि नहीं, अगर ट्रिकी उनको रोज नहीं देखेगा या वो ट्रिकी को रोज नहीं देखेंगी तो शी और ही इज गोइंग टू डाई. बट आई टुक अ फर्म लाइन. बट मिस्टर हैरियट अपने डिसीजन पे फर्म थे. एंड ट्रिकी वॉज वेरी इल, एंड दिस वॉज द ओनली वे टू सेव हिम. ट्रिकी बहुत बीमार था, एंड दिस वॉज द ओनली वे टू सेव हिम. एंड इन फैक्ट आई थॉट इट बेस्ट टू टेक हिम विदाउट डिले. एंड ही जस्ट थॉट कि ये बेस्ट होगा दैट विदाउट मेकिंग एनी डिले आई शुड टेक ट्रिकी. Followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailing, I marched out to the car, carrying the little dog, where to wrapped in a blanket. The entire staff was roused, and maids rushed in and out, bringing his daybed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. And realizing that my car would never hold all the stuff, I started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, threw an armful of little coats through the window. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everything was in tears. Out on the road, I glanced at the pathetic little animal, gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Poor old lad, I said, you haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. Now he says, now, followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailing, he just marched out to do what? To the car, carrying the little dog wrapped up in the blanket. Now he says the entire staff was roused. पूरा staff उठ गया, and the maids rushed in and out, bringing his day bed, bringing his night bed, his favorite cushions, his toys, rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. Now see, dog has bowl for each meal, separate bowl for each meal. Now Mr. Harriet, realizing that his car will not be able to hold any more stuff than this, so उसके बाद में क्या हुआ? तो जब उनको देखा कि इससे ज्यादा स्टफ हम नहीं होल्ड करने वाले, he just started to drive away. And as he moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, she just threw an armful of the little coats through the window. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. And before that, with a despairing cry, she just threw an armful of little coats through the window. And he says that I just looked out from the mirror before I turned the drive, and I saw कि सब रो रहे थे. Everybody was in tears. Out on the road, I glanced at the pathetic little animal gasping on the seat by my side. I patted the head. Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Poor old lad, I said, you haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. Out on the road, now he says, I glanced down at the pathetic little animal, gasping on the seat by my side, and I just patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. And he said, poor old lad, I said, you haven't a kick in you. तुम्हें तो बिल्कुल हिम्मत नहीं है. But I think I know a cure for you. So this is the first part. Now see the second part we are going to read. From that, what we are going to find out is the narrators as rich as Tricky's mistress. Narrator is who? Dr. James Harriet. How does he treat the dog? And why is he tempted to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest? Why does Mrs. Pumphrey think dog's recovery is a triumph of surgery? Now see. Now the thing is, at the surgery, the household dog searched round me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes, and when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dog, after sniffing round him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. So at the surgery, जो household dogs थे, they searched round me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes, and when put down, he was lying motionless on the carpet. Other dogs were just sniffing round him for a few seconds and decided that he was an interesting object, and they just ignored him. And I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the dogs slept. For 2 days, I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings. And on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. Now, I made up a bed for him in the warm, loose box just next to the one where other dogs slept. For 2 days, I just kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. एट द एंड ऑफ द सेकेंड डे उसने थोड़ा सा इंटरेस्ट दिखाना शो किया अपने सराउंडिंग्स में एंड ऑन द थर्ड ही बिगेन टू विम्पर व्हेन ही हर्ड द डॉग इन द यार्ड एंड ऑन द थर्ड डे ही जस्ट बिगेन टू विम्पर व्हेन ही हर्ड द डॉग्स इन द यार्ड व्हेन आई ओपनड द डोर Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. Now he says, when I opened the door, Tricky just trotted out and was engulfed by Joe, which was the greyhound dog, and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, dogs जो थे, they moved off down the garden, and Tricky very interestingly followed them, rolling slightly with surplus fat. Now Tricky was having little fat, तो वो roll down करता हुआ चला गया. Later that day, I was present at the feeding time. I watched while Tristan slooped the food into the bowls. And later that day, he says that I was present at the feeding time. I watched किस तरह से ट्रिस्टन ने सब डॉग्स के बाउल्स में फूड प्लेस किया था. ठीक है. Now once placed the food, there was the usual headlong rush followed by the sound of high speed eating. क्या था? हेडलॉन्ग था, यूजुअल हेडलॉन्ग रश था, सबके सब खाना खा रहे थे, एंड हाई स्पीड ईटिंग साउंड्स वर इन दी surroundings. I can hear, narrator was saying, every dog knew that if he fell behind the other, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. And हर dog इस तरीके से स्पीड से खा रहा था that the dog knew that अगर वो किसी तरीके से पीछे रह गए ना, they are definitely going to have some competition for the last part of his meal. Okay, so see, now when they had finished, जब उन्होंने अपना खाना फिनिश किया, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran along with the dogs. Joining in their friendly scrimmages, he discovered the joys of being bound over, tramped on, squashed every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely silky object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at the mealtime, hunting rats in the old hen house at night, and he had never had such a time in his life. Now you can see when they finished, Tricky took a walk around the shining bowls and he licked casually inside one or two of them. तो इससे क्या पता चल रहा था? That Tricky को भूख लग रही थी. Tricky was having his appetite bad. So next day an extra bowl was put for him, and I was just pleased to see कि Tricky कितना jostle करता हुआ अपने खाने के बाउल की तरफ आ रहा था. From then on, his progress was rapid and he had no medicinal treatment of any kind. But all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages, and he discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely and silky little object among the shaggy crew. He fought like a tiger for his share at the mealtime. खाने के लिए तो वो शेर की तरह लड़ लेता था. And at the night time, what he did, hen house में जाके, he just hunt rats. And he was enjoying such a great time that we can say that he had never had such a time in his life yet. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen of times a day for the latest bulletins. I dodged the question about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct corn worn according to the weather, but I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convulsing rapidly. Now, all the while, Mrs. Pumphrey just hovered anxiously in the background. ringing a dozen of times a day for the latest bulletin. I just dodged the question about whether कि उसके cushions जो हैं they are turned regularly or not, whether he has worn a correct coat or not, and I was able to tell her that little fellow was out of danger and was recovering rapidly. The word convulsing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. ये जो word था ना recovering, convulsing, it really did something to Mrs. Pumphrey. And उन्हें तो बस पता लगने की देर थी that Ricky is recovering and he has started having food and बस फिर क्या हुआ? She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozens at a time, to build up Ricky's strength. For a happy period, my partner and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottle of wine began to arrive and real possibility of the situation began to dawn on the household, it was to enrich Ricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. Now, what happened? जैसे ही उन्हें पता चला that Rick is recovering and has started eating something. Now, fresh eggs, 2 dozens at a time started coming to build up Ricky's strength. For a happy period, Mr. Harriet and his partner had 2 eggs each for breakfast. And when the bottle of wine began to arrive, the real possibility of the situation became down on the household. That it was a kind of ceremonial lunch. It was to enrich Ricky's blood. Now, lunch was ceremonial occasion for Mr. Harriet and the partner, companion, that is with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. Now, says, we could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution for a few nights. The fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled and reverently drunk. Now, hardly हम believe कर पाए at the final edge क्या आया brandy आ गई and for a few nights the fine spirit was rolled around inhaled and we just reverently drunk means we enjoyed a lot happily drunk. देवर डेज वो डेज जो थे ना वर ऑफ डीप कंटेंट बहुत तसल्ली के दिन थे starting with an extra egg in the morning improved and sustained by the midday wine and finishing luxuriously round with fire with a brandy. Now they say that starting with extra egg in the morning improved and sustained the midday wine and finishing luxuriously with fire with the brandy, this was something great. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight, felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey, almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better? Yes, he's fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I will go and fetch him. I says कि ये बहुत deep content के days थे ठीक है and he says that it was a kind of temptation कि मैं ट्रिकी को अपना permanent guest रख लेता हूँ but I really felt because I also have an emotional corner in me and that emotional corner told me that Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering and after a fortnight after a period of 15 days he just felt compelled that he should phone Mrs. Pumphrey and tell her that the little dog has recovered and was awaiting collection and you can come and take your dog. So within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black drew up outside the surgery. Chauffeur opened the door and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. क्या मेरा ट्रिकी सच में ठीक है? Yes, he is fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him. And he says, yes, he is absolutely fine. And there is no need कि आप गाड़ी से बाहर आएं. I'll go and just fetch him. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dog was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. In the 2 weeks he had been transformed into a lean, hard-muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack of dogs, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. And I just walked through the house into the garden. Mass of dog was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in the midst, who was there? In the midst, there was ear flapping, tail waving, a little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks, वो transform हो गया into a very lean, hard-muscled animal, and he was keeping up well with the pack of other dogs. And stretching out in great bounds, his chest was almost brushing the ground. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open. मैं उसे लेकर के आया along the passage to the front of the house, and the chauffeur was still holding the car door open when Tricky saw his mistress. As soon as, जैसे ही देखो यहाँ पे क्या लिखा है, as soon as Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms. He just took off from the arms of Mr. Harriet in a tremendous leap, in one great leap, and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. And he just sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled oh, and she was so startled, so surprised, and she said oh, and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her. And then she just had to defend herself, protect herself, because Tricky just swarmed over her, licking her face and barking, and he was just licking her face and barking because Tricky was as well excited to meet Mrs. Pumphrey. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, bowl, and none of which had been used. And during this excitement, I just helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, and bowls, and none of which had been used. जिनमें से कुछ भी use नहीं हुआ है. As the car moved, जैसे ही car move हो रही थी ना, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Mrs. Pumphrey just leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. आंसू थे उनकी आंखों में. Her lips trembled, and her lips were trembling. Oh, Mr. Harriet, she cried, and she said, oh, Mr. Harriet, how can I ever thank you? मैं आपको कैसे thank you बोलूं? This is the triumph of your victory. This is the great victory of your surgery, that you had made my Tricky well again and given him back to me. Okay, written by James Harriet. So this is the basic text. So we can see that in short, we are going to quick revise it, that when veterinary surgeon Harriet came across Mrs. Pumphrey's dog, he saw his condition health-wise was very bad, and he just advised Mrs. Pumphrey to cut his diet, that you should not feed him more and give him more exercise. But this did not happen, and because of this lack of exercises and overeating, Tricky became obese. Okay, and this way his health deteriorated. He stopped eating anything and constantly vomiting, and he was not at all moving. So now Mrs. Pumphrey called the veterinary surgeon and asked him what to do. Now he decided that Tricky needs to be hospitalized for 15 days, that is fortnight, and he should be kept under observation. Now, the main reason was to prevent Tricky from being overfeeded by Mrs. Pumphrey, so that he can bring him back to his health. Okay, so this was done. While under observation, Tricky is made to follow strict diet by Mr. Harriet. Obese dog gradually shows signs of improvement, and Mrs. Pumphrey is over anxious about Tricky's health and wants to know that if he's making any progress or not. So she continuously kept on calling him. तो ये कॉलिंग्स चलती रही, and later what happens? On learning that yes, Tricky has regained his health, now she again started interfering with the diet by sending dozens of eggs, alcohol such as wine and brandy, hoping that this is going to enrich Tricky's blood and is going to help Tricky recover fast. These items were actually consumed by who? Not Tricky, but by Mr. Harriet and his partners. As the former believed, क्योंकि जो Mr. Harriet and he believes that Tricky did not need them. Tricky recovers completely from an overweight, rotund dog. He just transformed into a limber and hard-muscled dog. Now, when Mrs. Pumphrey arrives to collect Tricky, Tricky is thrilled to see her, and it goes back into her arms, and an equally exhilarated Mrs. Pumphrey thanks Mr. Harriet for bringing Tricky back to the health, and she says that this is the triumph of your surgery. Okay, fine. I hope the chapter is well clear to you. Okay, so quickly हम इन questions को एक बार देखते हैं. What kind of person do you think the narrator, veterinary surgeon is, and would you say he's tactful as well as full of common sense? Yes, जो हमारे डॉक्टर थे and he veterinary surgeon, he is capable and a compassionate and a wise doctor, and he handles Tricky properly. And yes, he is a tactful person because he knew how to convince Mrs. Pumphrey to hospitalize Tricky for surgery. He understand, he sympathize, and he very sensibly he kept the dog with him and treated him without a single medicine. He just cured him nicely. And do you think, second one, Tricky was happy to go home? What do you think will happen now? Yes, Tricky was happy to go home back as he really loved and missed his mistress. And I just think that Mrs. Pumphrey will be careful about Ricky's diet and health from now. And she's also going to make him exercise daily as prescribed by the veterinary doctor earlier. Do you think this is a real life episode or a mere fiction, or is it a mixture of both? What do you think? It seems to be a mixture. It may be possible for a rich person to overfeed their pets due to overload, and it is not unusual for them to maintain a vast wardrobe for them. But unlikely for a veterinary doctor to go out on the way and lie in order to save an animal. It is also unusual for anyone to consume food which is given in the name of pet's health. So we can say that it's a real life episode also, and it can be a mere fiction. So it's mixture of. Okay. Now you see, this episode describes the silly talk about it, silly behavior of a rich woman who is foolishly indulgent, perhaps because she's lonely. Do you think such persons are merely silly, or can their actions cause harm to others? Yes, we can say it had a harmful reaction on Tricky's health because overparenting, overfeeding Tricky in the name of love, this worsened his condition. And this we can say actions can definitely have dangerous consequences for others also. Do you think there are parents like Mrs. Pumphrey? Yes, there are, who just spoil their children by pampering them. What would you have done if you were member of the staff in Mrs. Pumphrey's household or a neighbor? What would your life have been like in general? तो इसको अगर हम उसके स्टाफ मेंबर होते तो आई वुड हैव blindly followed whatever instructions my madam gives me, because जैसे वो मुझे बोलती according to that I just have to follow it. And if I were the neighbor, I would have advised her to consult the veterinary doctor, follow his advice, and strictly keep in mind Tricky's deteriorating health. And for that, because she's a very loving lady, so मैं उन्हें एक अच्छी सी advice देता, so that she should keep in her mind how to take good care of Tricky and how to save his health from getting deteriorate. What would you have done if you were in narrator's place? अगर मैं नरेटर की प्लेस में होते तो what would I have done? I have treated Ricky with a similar amount of compassion and love. I have been equally caring as Dr. Harriet has been towards Tricky, and I would just have been a little more stern while advising Mrs. Pumphrey to put Tricky on a strict diet, knowing her the way of showing love. So this is the thing what would I have done if I would have been in place of narrator. Okay, students, so all this is clear. So PDF you will be getting, and this is all we can say for today's class. So with this, our chapter and class is finished for today. We'll be meeting in our next class tomorrow. Till then, just take care of yourself.